Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I am so happy to see so many faces here. My name is Rhea Castronovo, and I am the Vice President of Alpha Phi Sigma, which is the Criminal Justice Honored Society here at the university. In 2017, we started an event series that includes panel discussions, speaker events, and other forms of dialogue on issues related to criminology, criminal justice, and the law. I'd like to take a minute to thank the students, faculty, and staff of the School of Public Affairs for their support and extend a special thank you to the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Paul Teskey, for his help, and to our Marketing Director, Tula Wellbrook, who's way in the back there, hey girl, for facilitating these events. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Criminal Justice Honor Society Alpha Phi Sigma for their role in putting together these events. And of course, thank you all so much for joining me here tonight. Also, thank you to the about 70 people that are joining us virtually on Zoom. They are here, just not physically. This evening's panel discussion focuses on juvenile justice, as hopefully you're all aware. If anyone's not here for juvenile justice, I invite you to stay anyway. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm going to ask the questions to the panelists and keep time. If we get into a really awesome discussion, I might not monitor it so closely because they are the experts, but I will be here to just make sure that things keep rolling. And the last 20 minutes of this event is reserved for audience questions. So please feel free to ask them. I'll let you know when that time comes, and we'll go around with a microphone, which I'm sure you're all super excited about, to have your voice this loud like mine. And for those of us joining on Zoom, feel free to just pop questions into the chat, and Tula can ask them on your behalf, okay? Awesome. Thank you again so much for coming. I'm super excited to see you all tonight. I'd like to ask you guys to introduce yourselves. We have Charles, Samantha, and Andrew, and I'll let them take it from here for a moment. Go ahead.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. You all look amazing and fantastic. I'm thrilled that would be kind of messed up to say that you look that way and I didn't mean it, but no, you all look so great. Great to be with you all tonight. My name is Charles Guilford III. Most recently, in terms of kind of what I do, worked as a Director of Regional Affairs in the Mayor's Office in Denver. So one of the key projects that I got to tackle and focus on was the regional compact that exists between Denver and Aurora with a concentration on youth violence. So excited to kind of bring that lens in terms of collaboration and perspective, but more importantly, have a broader conversation with youth violence. Colorado native, Denver born, Aurora raised. So very excited to be here and to speak on that capacity. So looking forward to connecting with these amazing people who I'm not qualified to share the same space as, but excited to have a conversation tonight.
Hi, everybody. My name is Samantha Wilson, and I'm the director of the Rocky Mountain Youth Services Center in Lakewood. You might have formerly known it as Mount View. It's located on Hamden and Wadsworth, and hopefully there'll be some context for me to talk about it a little bit more because of why it's called Rocky Mountain and that it's not a giant facility anymore. So it is the detention facility. I have worked with high-risk youth since 1 month before I graduated from Metro all the way back in 1998. And this is my alma mater. I got my master's from UCD as well. So this is kind of an awesome full circle moment for me. And I'm really excited to share what I have and hopefully, leave you with something that you didn't know before.
Okay, everyone can hear me all right? My name is Andrew Martinez. I'm a probation officer with Adams County. I supervise juveniles. I'm on the juvenile caseload. I work out of the Commerce City office, so majority of my kiddos are from obviously the Commerce City area, North Aurora, basically anywhere in Aurora, north of Colfax, some North Denver kids, Northeast Denver, and those type of kiddos. So I've been doing that for about 5 years. Prior to that, I actually worked at Rocky Mountain Youth Services Center, formerly known as Mount View Youth Services Center.
We never worked together. So
We
it's
did.
a small world.
Right. And I worked there for 5 years as a youth corrections officer. Working with high-risk kids, and was born in the Bay Area in California. I've been out in Colorado for about 15 years. So I'm really excited to be here today and share with you my whatever little knowledge I have to share, and excited to be here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We'll go ahead and jump in. What are some of the more common crimes juveniles in Colorado commit, and what actions are taken within your office or agency to prevent them or facilitate justice for the victims while rehabilitating the offender?
So we collect a lot of data. in the Division of Youth Services. And we put out a monthly report that includes the reasons why youth are committed to the Division of Youth Services. And so one piece of data that I do know that kind of answers part of this question is that up until about 5 or 7 years ago, 60 to 70% of youth that were committed to DYS were committed for property crimes. And there was a small segment, maybe, 10 to 15% of youth that were committing crimes on people, and that had, victims that were personally, physically harmed by that youth, and those numbers have flipped. And so the majority of the youth that are committed to the Division of Youth Services are committed because of a crime against a person. And so some of the things that we're doing, in fact, the timing of this for me is really good, because we're starting to incorporate DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. It's already a division-wide, kind of model, and we just did a lot of training for our committed programs, but my program is detention. And so the average length of stay for detained youth across the state is 20 days. And so figuring out how to take that programming model and squish it down so that it has a large impact on a kid that we may only have for 2 days. We have my average length of stay right now is 60 days, but we get kids that literally come and go in an afternoon. And so how to make the biggest impact and where to incorporate mindfulness skills and where to incorporate emotional intelligence. I think those are a few things that the state of Colorado, the Division of Youth Services, is doing to impact those numbers. My goal would be to, every year decrease the amount of detained youth that end up being sentenced to a commitment facility. And so we're hopeful that incorporating DBT and the sanctuary model are going to be able to help us do that.
Yeah, I mean, Samantha obviously has a much better idea kind of on that. I can kind of speak from my perspective as a probation officer. A lot of the crimes that we see today, and I think a lot of this is kind of due to a lot of the juvenile justice reform and the changes that are trying to be made in the juvenile justice system. But to get a kid on probation, a lot of the kids are committing more serious offenses. So we have, obviously I have a pretty high risk population with the kiddos I work with. I would say probably 80 to 90% of my kids are on for some sort of weapon offense. So handgun possession, just various weapon offenses. We used to see a lot of, third degree assault, property crimes, different things like that. But with juvenile justice reform, they're trying to, I think, divert some of those kids that may not be so appropriate for probation supervision and leaving us with a lot of the resources we have to kind of deal with some of the kiddos that might need some more resources just due to their situations. For example, probably about 4 years ago, I had a kid that was on for petty theft under $50. And there wasn't a lot we could really do for that kid. He actually had a lot of support in place at home. So those are the type of kids we're not seeing on probation as much anymore. We're seeing kids that are a lot more high risk, high need. That way, we're kind of better equipped to help them and their families with some of the resources we have. And again, that's just me with my specific caseload, just being in the Commerce City office within Adams County. We also have an office in Westminster and an office in Brighton. And it's just a different population. There's different demographics between Commerce City and Aurora than kind of some of the northern suburb kiddos. So you have a kid that's committing a different type of crime. So they might be seeing different kids on for different offenses. But again, from my specific experience, that's kind of what I'm seeing a lot of. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Charles, or if we want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the things that we do to curb that too.
Not a whole lot, to add to that. Only thing that may be interesting to kind of introduce, just even at utilizing some of the state data in terms of some of the crimes is, crimes, but yes, but Statistically, when you look over this year over year, particularly looking at the state data, what's interesting is the number one crime that is committed per the state is marijuana, with assault as a second. So just kind of curious around your thoughts, because my sentiment regarding this is, as much as we call weed a gateway drug, it's really, from a youth violence perspective, a gateway sentence, and how this introduces and starts moving our young people into a space where, you know, it starts off here, but because it's criminalized, then it moves into a different space and a different tier because of them being absent from school in terms of, and the lack of resources to support said issue. So just curious around your thoughts around that, not to hijack, but just.
Yeah.
Well, when we do an assessment called the YASI, and what it stands for is escaping me right now, but it's a risk assessment tool. And so when kids are committed, they go through 30 days of assessment, and the assessment therapy team does the YASI. And one of the things they assess for is criminogenic risk, but then they also assess like substance abuse, but substance abuse doesn't play a part in the criminogenic risk piece unless they were high while they committed their crime. So being high or possession is not in and of itself a criminal risk factor. It's what they did while they were under the influence. And so I'm not sure exactly how that plays into your question.
Right. No, that's helpful. I think.
But we're definitely not seeing kids coming in for, I don't know if you'd call it like petty or simple possession, because they're like Andrew just said, they're coming in for way more serious crimes. There's I don't know if you'd call it an agency, but CYDC is the Colorado Youth Detention Continuum, and they literally work to keep kids out of detained and committed programs. So Andrew's petty offense $50 kid is now a kid that this team of people across the state are trying to keep out of our facilities. But then when they get the kid that's arrested for, name the serious offense, then those are the kids that are coming to us.
Right. So there's still, some sort of accountability and rehabilitation that's offered, and so that way kids aren't reoffending no matter what the offense is. But kind of to answer you, Charles, I think marijuana is a drug of choice still with the kids. But I definitely think that
sometimes inside the facilities, we can talk about that later.
But I do think that that's something that's being recognized by our courts and by the judicial system. Within the last year, since juvenile justice reform kind of took place, they're really trying to focus on the assessments. That way we're kind of appropriately matching, a kid's needs or a family's needs. That way we can respond appropriately with resources and stuff. So if a kid, if substance use isn't a problem for him, it's not something we're going to monitor on probation. If a kid has never really had any history, then that's not something we're necessarily going to monitor unless we discover that it's a problem later down the road. Or maybe a kid does have history with substance use, but it's not a disruption in their life at all. So if maybe a kid smoked weed or something on prom night or whatever the case is, and he discloses that he has a history of substance use or he drank once or twice, then again, it's not something that we're going to let kind of overrun supervision from a probation perspective, because I guess kind of what the history and what the statistics tell us is that we want to appropriately match. We want a treatment match. So we want to supervise the kid or any offender kind of where they're at with things. So if substance use isn't a problem, that's not something we're going to include in their supervision. We're going to focus on the things that need to focus on. So I don't know if that's kind of maybe the tail end of the issue, but I think that kind of ties in.
It's the risk. It's all about risk. What's the highest risk that we need to provide services for?
And if we have time to keep going, I guess that second part of that question, I don't know that I really touched base on, at least from a probation perspective, but I know a model that we use is the the 8 guiding principles, right? Evidence-based practices, and I'm sure many of you here has probably heard it. It was something we used in Division of Youth Services, and it's something that plays a big role in all of probation, whether you're supervising juveniles or adults. But basically, yes, we're trying to target the specific criminogenic needs, kind of like we're talking about. So whether it's substance abuse or antisocial peers or any of the big criminogenic needs, we use the assessments. That's kind of the biggest thing that we use to make sure that we're appropriately supervising a kid and we're meeting them where they're at. And I mean, we could go through all of them, but that's kind of the groundwork of what we do with supervision. Positive reinforcements is a huge one for us. What we use through probation, and it's actually becoming a statewide program, is strategies for behavior change. And essentially it's just an incentive and sanction model method that we use to kind of help curb behaviors and help motivate behavior change. So that's something we use. We try to use kind of with SBC, it's a 4-to-1 incentive to sanction model, and it's the same thing that you do when you're raising kids, right? If you want to encourage a behavior, you're going to incentivize it, no matter kind of how big or small it is. And we usually have the juvenile, and again, it's something that's used in adult probation too, but we have the client assist us in kind of picking their incentives and different things like that. That way it's meaningful, because Charles could be doing something really well, but if I try to incentivize him with something that he doesn't care about, it's not going to be as impactful. So we kind of really try to get engagement from the kids when we're using that. And obviously we still want to sanction behaviors that we don't want to see. So if a kid is still using on probation, or if they're violating curfew, or if they're not following any of their conditions that the court sentences them to, then we obviously want to address those too. So that's something we're actively doing throughout a caseload or throughout a sentence while they're on probation. So those are kind of a couple of the things that we do. I'm not sure if anyone in here is kind of familiar with the 8 guiding principles of evidence-based practices, but that's kind of what we do.
They're segueing beautifully. I don't even need to be here, so.
I mean,
No, you guys are going right
And
down the
somewhat,
line.
yeah.
For those of you keeping track, they're going through the questions as perfectly, so I'm just gonna hang back. I'm just kidding. I do want to follow up on that. I'm glad that you mentioned sort of some preventative measures, but I think that also the victim sometimes
Yes.
gets forgotten. So I'm
Yes.
wondering what your thoughts are on how to bring the victim into that, preventative plan, as well as, the rehabilitative plan, and then just, what position the victim has in the work that you do with juveniles.
Yeah, and I think that that's something, at least again, and I can only kind of speak from the probation perspective, but that's something that's always kind of that we kind of try to juggle with a little bit. I think it's obviously something that's important. That's kind of as much as we are there to kind of offer resources, services, and rehabilitate an offender. Our role is also community safety, right, and making sure that a person that's on probation supervision is accounted for and being held accountable. So there's a bunch of different things that I think we can do. I think obviously, I mean, there's a lot of kids who will have restitution payments that are owed. That's monies that are owed directly to a victim in an offense. There's different things that a court could sentence them to, like community service. Sometimes the judges will get kind of creative, especially with juveniles, and look at having them do apology letters and different things like that that could, be directed towards a victim. But it is something that as probation officers that we really try to encourage our clients to really think about. We do a lot of case planning with our juveniles. And that's a big part of it, is kind of like, what is the victim impact here? What is the effect of your offense? How does it affect a direct victim. And a lot of times there's certain crimes that can be seen, especially by an offender, as like, you know, a victimless crime, like a kid that comes in with handgun possession and he's like, well, I didn't hurt anyone. But we kind of encourage them and challenge them to kind of think beyond that. Think about the parents that had to bring them to the probation appointment, you know, once a month or whatever it may be.
Well, and you work with them, you know, in a one-on-one direct capacity. So I'm kind of curious, Samantha, how that works when there's a lot more people involved. What's your take on that?
So the first kind of point that I want to make is that in detention, we do not deal with victims at all. And it's because they're alleged victims while we have youth in detention. However, once they're committed, we're all about victims. And so we have, DYS has an RCJ coordinator who has 2 people that work for her. And their job is to not only develop and facilitate RCJ curriculum around the division, but restorative community justice, but it's also to facilitate, when approved, victim offender dialogue. And so it doesn't happen as often as we like, because on the one hand, it seems like, well, it makes a lot of sense to just, you know, get a kid to say that they're sorry to their victim. And on the other hand, you will not be surprised to find out that it is not that easy. That there are a lot of steps that need to go through, both by the victim and the offender. But there are a lot of rules, for example, like our kids are not allowed to contact their victims. And so if there is a named victim, then the no call list for a particular kid will include their victim. And you would be surprised how many try, whether it's to re-victimize or because they want to apologize. So we actually have to keep a really close watch on who kids are calling, because they'll try to call their victims. But it's always been something that's really important to DYS, to acknowledge and support the victims of youth in committed facilities.
And one more thing we do on probation too, and we can move on to the next question. But we monitor too, if there's restraining orders or no contact orders or things like that, to the best of our ability. But that's something we monitor too. And then another program we have on probation is there's a victim notification thing that's, I'm not sure if it's victim services through the counties that kind of run that, but we work with them. So victims, if they opt into that program, if they're a victim of a crime, they will be notified of updates with court dates, updates in supervision, if the client reoffends, if they're getting ready to get off probation. So if you opt into the victim notification program, that way you can, kind of be a little bit engaged in the offenders with their supervision. So that's another thing that we do for victims as well.
And in our facilities, it's not all that infrequent for one of our youth to commit a crime on either another youth or a staff member while they're in our facility. So it's doesn't happen all of the time, but we have one particular kid right now that I think I've called the police like 6 times on in detention because of property destruction or assaulting somebody. And there's always that one kid, right? So all of the kids are not like that, but if you have one kid like that in your facility and they're just victimizing people and staff, then they go on special programs. We call them individual growth and change plan, where they can be isolated and then work to be accountable while they're there. Yeah. Great question. Yes. In fact, within the last couple of years, we just started to provide therapists to our detained youth. So we've always had what we call behavioral health specialists work with. Most of them are licensed, working with our youth in committed programs. And within the last 2 years, we used to have contracted therapists that came in to work with detained youth, and now they're all state employees. So they all have a caseload. We have to assign a kid to a BHS within 48 hours. Great
Charles, I
question.
saw you looking at your notes.
No, just to kind of add to this, because as we're thinking about youth violence and particularly how we collaborate and particularly with the issue of victims, one of the interesting things that we, in my opinion, need to consider is the entire ecosystem, of what this looks like. So a person who's, involved in the judicial system, but one of the conversations that I was having with some of our hospital providers inside of the regional compact was this holistic approach, which is, particularly from a victim standpoint, if there's been a violent act committed against the victim, while that person is in hospital care, how do we get wraparound services to that person? Because as soon as that person leaves, they're out the door. And based upon HIPAA protections and things of that nature, you can't necessarily refer that person, even though they may need counseling, even though they may need, these kind of support and services. How do we make sure that we revisit what that experience looks like? What does wraparound services look like, particularly in a traumatic space, particularly with city hospitals or hospitals within certain confines? And the good thing is there's a willingness, to do that there, but there's also an interesting nuance as it pertains to different communities who may be more receptive or not as receptive, to mental health resources or to those kind of things, but nonetheless offering them and making sure that they're aware that those things exist is something that I think is the next iteration and evolution of what it looks like to actually help victims. Because above and beyond just that touch point, here's other places that you can connect to outside of this that are going to be cost effective, that are going to have sliding scales for counseling, et cetera, that are sensitive to the needs of those individuals who are coming in those spaces. So just wanted to offer that as something that we're seeing, particularly in Denver hospitals, is them really exercising, hey, have you considered, therapy? Here's a resource that you can connect to. Hey, this sounds like, your children may be impacted. You may want to connect them to certain resources, because the kind of cycle that we see as we're talking about victimization is trauma. So the older brother, older sister is a victim of some kind of crime, et cetera, and the younger brother or younger sister or the younger people in that house witness that. And there's a trauma and a pathway that is created, for them, whether it's directly into that kind of life or at a minimum, more mental health challenges, more emotional issues, more things that show up in an academic space or at a minimum in a social space that we got to take a look at.
Well, and I think that ties in victimization as well because of secondary victimization, which for those of you that don't know is when you witness someone else, being victimized, like just witnessing it also makes you a victim. So that's definitely an important aspect of that as well. And a great segue, speaking of services, I know we've talked a little bit about detention, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on juvenile detention and diversion? So to what extent and under what circumstances, should either or both be used? And what are some of the best practices that can be implemented to ensure that they're used effectively?
I mean, I could talk a little bit about that, and that's, I think that's kind of really been under the microscope within the last year and was kind of led a lot of the juvenile justice reform that was, that legislation was working on. And I think, when they should be used, like we were talking about, I think if it's when we're assessing kids and families, but mostly the kids, we can appropriately put a kid in diversion and keep them out of the justice system, keep them out of the judicial system if they are a lower risk, lower need kiddo. And if it is a kid that needs more services and more resources and access to some of those things, maybe more structure, and if that's determined by the assessments that we do, then it is appropriate to have a kid, under some sort of community supervision, or if needed, detention. Sometimes there's not a lot of other options. That usually is the very, very, very last resort, is to have a kid in detention. Along with juvenile justice reform, there's the Family First Act that kind of went into place this past year, where I know Department of Human Services obviously plays a really big role. The caseworker for a family will literally has to exhaust every single option to place a kid in either some sort of family placement or look into different out-of-home placements, group homes, different things like that, if that's more appropriate. Detention is usually the very, very last resort. but sometimes that is where a kid will end up. And it's very, very rare that you ever see that a kid is in detention just because of there's nowhere for them to go. It's usually a violent kid, a kid that presents a safety risk either to themselves or the community, a kid that's a run risk. So maybe they can't stay in one place, they're not making court dates, different things like that. So there's very, very specific criteria that a youth has to meet to be able to be placed in detention. But that, we have it for a reason as well. And that's obviously kind of a broad spectrum between diversion, from keeping a kid completely out of the justice system, having charges dismissed, and maybe having some sort of supervision, all the way to detention. And then there's a ton of things that we do in between as well. And it's just, again, based on the risk need assessments that we do and trying to meet the kid where they're at to the best of our abilities. I think that was it for some of the best practices. Yeah. Do you want anything?
Yeah, so I have been in this position for almost a year now, and I have yet to reach my cap. I've never been full. So I can take up to 22 kids. Today, I have 17. When I get close to 18, 19, then we have to have what's called an emergency release meeting. And what that means is that there are bed managers that work for the 2 districts that send kids to me. And we have a meeting and we pick out the top 3 releasable youth. That has become more and more challenging because of the crimes that kids are sent to us on and the type of bonds that they have, right? So it used to be that a kid could have a straight release, they'd go to court, they would come and they'd get all their paperwork through us, and then they would go home with their parents. Then we started to see more of what's called a PR bond, which is personal recognizance, which typically they get released to their parents. Less and less parents are picking their kids up. Today, out of the 17 kids that I have, 13 are on no bond holds. And what a no bond hold is that they're not going anywhere until a judge says that they are. So whether it's because they're awaiting trial, or they have a jail sentence, or they have, we have one kid on $100,000 bond. He's not going anywhere until trial. And so I think that kind of speaks to 2 of the things that we've been talking about. So on the one hand, the vast majority of my population is in for serious offenses, murder, attempted murder, SO, youth committing, sex offense crimes. And on the other hand, I have 5 open beds, which means that there's 5 kids out there somewhere that someone like Andrew has determined through an assessment they don't meet the need of being in my detention facility. So I feel like if you look at it that way, it's working, right? So we have the kids that should be detained in detention and they're not going anywhere. And the kids that are committing petty crimes, substance abuse offenses, possession of drugs offenses are being able to remain with their parents or in, whatever type of placement they're at, because all the assessments that are done in the community work.
And the assessments are done with purpose too, right? So we're not just sending a kid back home with no plan, okay?
Right.
There's usually, if a kid appears in court, they're usually assigned a caseworker through Department of Human Services if it's appropriate. If a parent doesn't appear in court date, they'll be assigned a guardian ad litem that can represent the youth. So there's safety plans and things like that are put into place before a kid gets home. So we're looking at what does a school program look like? Is a kid enrolled in school? If not, what can we do to get a kid into school? Does a kid need a substance abuse evaluation and treatment? Is that, a lot of times when they're able to, they'll set up those resources and those services prior to a kid being released from detention. That way you're not going out with nothing to do. And I mean, I don't know if we kind of briefly spoke on the second question with kind of the type of the, I guess the youth violence and stuff like that. Well, maybe we did talk about that, but I lost my train of thought. Where we were going. There was a connection there. But basically, yeah, so that's, like I said, we're not sending a kid out with no resources and saying, good luck, let's try this again. Because obviously the situation they were in, something wasn't working, right? Because they committed an offense, however big or small. But so there's, and I think that was what I wanted to tie it into with like the type of kids that are ending up in detention. Like Samantha had said, we have kids that are committing offenses, that are committing murder, that are committing attempted murder, serious assaults, and those type of things. And it's really, and it can be determined by a judge too, that this kid is not safe to be in the community. And a lot of times that's why they'll have either a no bond hold or different things like that. And usually even when they're in custody, there are services and things like that that are offered to them. But when a kid is released, there's usually a safety plan, and there's resources that are offered to the family, therapy, different things like that. A lot of times family therapy is kind of included in that because, again, something isn't working right.
Mhm.
So if we can go in and offer some of the various different types of therapy, cognitive-based therapy for a kid, family-based therapy for the entire family that everybody engages in. You kind of get a lot more buy-in, and I think you see a lot more success when those type of things are offered. And obviously there needs to be follow through, right, on the kiddos end, which you don't always see, but at least that's our job to kind of offer the help, offer the services, and that type of thing. So I think that kind of helps with the rehabilitation and kind of minimizing, or at least the hope to minimize the chance of any juvenile reoffending.
What's your take?
What was the question again? Sorry.
I don't remember
Hate to be
either.
that guy.
I know we started off talking about juvenile diversion versus detention, and then it sort of went from there. But if you have thoughts on diversion versus detention.
You know, the only thing that I would add, and they've said, quite a bit that I won't reiterate, but from a governmental perspective, and this becomes an interesting, issue in terms of, city to city, the philosophy that governmental body may have concerning diversion, concerning these different tactics and approach to youth. And one of the interesting things, regarding the regional compact between Denver and Aurora was frankly a philosophical difference on certain issues in terms of how to invest and to work with youth. Denver, has, quite a bit of granting that goes towards different organizations and nonprofit bodies that work directly, in both of those spaces. Whereas Aurora, has a different ecosystem. And part of the reason for that ecosystem is frankly, there's federal dollars that come, down to a city level. So part of this is not exclusively just on the backs of differing philosophy. It's just frankly how some of these funds are distributed and where they're resourced. So that's another part of the ecosystem that we have to look at. And as you're thinking about, for those of you who are School of Public Affairs students, it's really, frankly, following the money and following the resources and how it's structured. Because that also deals with not today's issue, but homelessness in terms of where funding from a federal, perspective comes and why Denver has, significant amount of capital and why other cities may not. So it may not be a moral issue for some cities or a values, system per se for other cities. It's just frankly how some things are distributed. However, particularly with this issue, because of the political philosophies that sometimes guide approaches to crime and guide approaches to youth involved in crime, you see a different tactic sometimes taken. And not saying that to indict one city or the other, but that's where some interesting tensions happen because our young people don't care about city lines. You can jump across Savannah and be in Denver, and then you can jump across and be in Aurora. And some of the challenges that we're seeing based upon ballistics, based upon a whole host of other things is that regional approach, to dealing with homelessness, that regional approach to dealing with a whole host of other issues has to come down to youth as well. And some of the challenges that we're seeing is because of a difference in philosophy. This nonprofit may be granted in this particular city and be able to serve these kids, but the same nonprofit will not be granted resources in this city to serve these kids because they think that young people may need more jobs and not necessarily wraparound services, and that this philosophy is not, quote unquote, evidence-based, although it's creating impact. And I'm not trying to, tout one or the other, but that's, as we're thinking about, again, ecosystem, that's a major, major challenge, particularly in today's political climate that we're seeing, is the incongruence of being able to have a conversation among the same data and being able to move forward with the same kind of philosophy, maybe differing, in different perspectives, but nonetheless anchoring in the same data and conversation nonetheless. So.
And it's interesting too that you bring that up, Charles, too, because that's, I mean, I can speak about a specific issue that we deal with in Adams County. Gangs are a huge part of juvenile, I mean, with probation, kids that are kind of end up in the system. There's a lot of gang involvement. We're in kind of an interesting place in Adams County. Basically, everything north of Colfax and Aurora is Adams County. We have Commerce City, we have gangs in Commerce City, we have Aurora gangs, you have some kids in Denver and things like that. We don't have a lot of gang prevention resources in Adams County. There is a great program in Denver. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the GRID program. We can't tap into that unless our kid lives in Denver. Or in a very unique situation where I had a kid I was supervising in Adams County who lived in Aurora, but his offense was committed in Denver. They worked with us and were able to help him and get him a gang mentor and that type of stuff. It was a lot of hoops we had to jump through. And then similarly with Aurora had GRASP, which was their gang prevention program. I don't know if that got up and running again, but it was shut down a number of years ago. And I don't know if you have any knowledge on this, but from what I was told, there was funding that went either to the gang program or to renovating traffic lights and things like that. And they took that funding, put it into, the infrastructure of the city and things like that.
Right.
And Aurora lost the gang prevention program. So we kind of run into some of those issues where I think, if you did have kind of more of a collaboration and kind of uniform standards across city lines and things like that, I think it could be beneficial, but I just wanted to touch on that since you brought that up, Charles.
I think that gives a very holistic and macro level view of problem solving when it comes to juvenile justice. So that's a really good point to make. Similarly to the problem solving and the obstacles that are, faced by juveniles and their supporters, what are the biggest barriers to reintegration when a juvenile returns to society, aside from, county lines and resources? Is there anything else that would be the main barrier or a big one?
I would just say in general, I think anybody who's worked in the system with system impacted youth would agree with how frustrating it is when a kid is in a facility like mine or on probation with Andrew and they learn a whole bunch of skills and you see it working in their mind and they're figuring it out. And then they go back to a home that has learned nothing of that.
Yes.
And that's where we get our reoffenders. And so for DYS, we're really big on family engagement and we put the opportunities out there. We have a weekly family advisory committee and there's 2 other facilities on our campus. So we have a total of like 75 kids and every week it's the same kid's sister that comes to the family advisory council for the last 6 weeks. One family member out of 75 kids comes. And so part of that is our problem, right? Because when we realize that there's an issue, then we need to figure out how to readjust to reach those families better. And it's a constant struggle, but that's something that you'll see quite often, especially with direct care staff who are more involved with the kids on a day-to-day level, that they start to get anxiety also when a kid's about to leave and they know that the kid is returning to a family that doesn't have the skills to support the skills that the kid just learned in the facility. Yeah.
Are there enough resources to actually send people out and visit the families?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's what, the 3 of us, it's kind of in the back of all of our answers is that it's such a resource issue. If we could have a caseworker check in on a family every day and just go have lunch with that family or have dinner or have an hour-long phone call with the family, we would see our, our youth crime would would drop. But where there simply aren't the resources. And then especially with COVID, we'll feel that forever. I don't know if it'll come around, but like one of the things that I'm interested in is recruiting, because 75% of our staff have not been with us for a year.
Right.
And our deployable staff numbers right now is 33%. That's pathetic. So that's a big issue. And it's not just us. It's not just residential. It's all kind of human services related jobs are just not being filled.
I mean, yeah, we touched
Wah,
on,
wah. You guys seen Debbie Downer on Saturday Night Live? That's me. Meow, meow.
that's gone down. I think when I was working in corrections, I think we were at about 70, 85% of
Oh,
deployable
it's
staff. So
terrible.
that's
It's
concerning
terrible.
to hear that
Yeah.
it's so low. Yeah, some of the barriers that, yeah, we run, yeah, you touched on a lot of it. The family thing, I mean, just to piggyback off that, that's something we see at probation a lot too. And it's kind of unfortunate, you know, families are to an extent ordered to engage in a juvenile's supervision as long as they're still a juvenile. So as long as they're a minor. When a kid gets sentenced to probation, at least, I don't know if this is something that's done across every county. I know it is something that's done in Adams County, but the judge has the parent sign a parental responsibility advisement form, which basically says that you're not signing your parental rights over to a probation officer or a caseworker. You are still expected to engage in the rehabilitation, the support of your kid. This is still your kid. Because oftentimes you'll see parents calling me all the time, you know, Johnny didn't make his bed. Johnny's not taking out the trash. He's being disrespectful. Those are things that need to still be addressed at home. We're not stepping in to be the parent. So that's kind of usually at an intake appointment, I'll set boundaries with parents and say, you know, if a kid is being disrespectful, or because that's kind of you know, something that can be that's subjective. Yeah.
Right. He told me no.
Yeah, yeah. You know, well, and it's like, again, it's something we want to encourage the parent to still be the parent. You know, if the kid obviously is committing or engaging in behavior that would violate their probation, like using substances or running away from home or different things like that, those are things that we do want to know. And we encourage parents to let us know. But similar to, I think, to what you're talking about in detention, in juvenile, the standards that are put out by the state, we're required to have one parent contact with the juvenile's parent on probation. So we usually see a parent at the intake appointment, if we can even get them to an intake appointment, and you don't see the parent again. And then you kind of wonder why the kid doesn't feel like they have the support at home or whatever the case may be. But you definitely do see a lot of success if you do get parent or family engagement or involvement. Something I talked about was the family therapy. We have MST, which is multi-systemic therapy. That's a family engaged kind of or a family centered program where everybody in the home is kind of engaged in therapy. That's a huge thing that we do with a lot of our kids. It's something that we can refer to from probation. It's something that DHS can refer to, and there's a handful of different agencies kind of in the metro area that will offer that. Not as many as we need, but we do have some options. But I think that's kind of the biggest barrier, is just kind of a lack of resources, not having a plan in place, no structure in the home, those type of things. Because I mean, all kids, I mean, are, you know, have personal interests, they have hobbies and things like that. And if they're not engaged in those type of things, then you're going to reoffend. If you're sitting around at home and with nothing to do, nobody watching you, then it makes sense why a kid is getting into trouble. And again, not you know, let a kid off the hook or not hold them accountable, but it's kind of getting to kind of the root of the problem. At least that's something that we try to support through probation. And it's far from a perfect system, but we don't, I think, have all the answers, but we're always.
Sounds
looking
like
for
you
them.
have all the
Yeah.
answers to me, so. Speaking of, I have so many questions, but I'd like to turn it over to the audience if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask, including our Zoom audience. So I'll let, I see a hand raised. Tula's gonna come over with the microphone so that I can hear you.
Yeah, actually, can we start with a Zoom question that was
Yeah,
submitted
let's
a
start with
while
the Zoom
back?
question, sure.
Okay, so this question, it's touching on something you've talked a little bit about, which is wraparound, like wraparound care. So are there any mentoring programs provided to adjudicated youth? This person knows of a pilot program in New Mexico that assigns multiple wraparound mentors to adjudicated youth, including both mentors within the justice system and partnering nonprofits. And there have been promising data coming out of this pilot. Is there any such thing here?
Me? No, happy to tag in. Great question. It honestly depends, and again, go back to a previous answer, it depends on the city. So for example, an organization that I'm a huge fan of, Fully Liberated Youth, is an organization that has been grant funded and is able to support and provide services to youth and to young people. But the challenge, goes to exactly what my friend was saying, which is, if that's a crime committed, in Denver, or a young person, who's involved in Denver versus a kid or a young person who's in a different city, it just depends. But would love to learn more about the organization that was mentioned. So I'll do some due diligence on that, from the Zoom, call. But in terms of wraparound services, there are wraparound services that exist, but it just depends on how complete and robust, depending on the city in which, that incident, or the crime is committed. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that goes into it. And then, yeah, there are resources, and I can't really speak so much for the adjudicated kids, since most of the kids I supervise have not been adjudicated. They are under community supervision. And we do have resources for those type of kiddos, but again, it's not enough. I think we probably have, actually, I would even say 1.5 agencies that we work with, because it's hard to get agencies involved and even to keep it going there. And if it's just for a lack of referrals or just a lack of money or whatever reason, agencies kind of fold. I do know that's a big problem that we've run into, the justice system as a whole, not even just probation, but there's just resources that we're losing a lot, and a lot of it was due to COVID. I know there was probably 6 placements that had closed probably within the last 1.5 years. So there's just not as much options for where to place kids, where kids to go, different things like that. And even the mentoring, like I said, with Adams County, we actually do have a really good program. Strengthening Lives, I think, is a program, and we have a really good mentor who actually used to be a probation officer, and he started up his own mentoring agency, and he's since hired a couple of people. So that's a resource we use a lot too, to kind of get kids on probation access to a mentor. But yeah, again, it's something that obviously is a needed resource. There's just not enough.
Thank you so much. And the gentleman in the blue shirt?
Yes. Mr. Martinez made me have a second thought about my two-pronged question. If we started with 2 prongs, you added a third prong. One is, what percentage of children or of youth offenders are from single parents? And because you said they're at home by themselves, how many come from 2-income families? I would like to know that statistic. And also, is being from a broken home a risk factor when you're, placing them? It is. Yeah. See, I would think that's it. I attended a seminar on criminal and domestic violence. Domestic violence ends in divorce, like 94%, and then gang violence proceeds from the broken families. So I could see the broken families coming from, being involved in gangs. But I was just curious if that was a statistic that was kept.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Let me see if I can start from the beginning. So Well, I mean, I'll start. I don't have the actual numbers. I wish I did. I was actually saying that just before we got here. I wish I would have pulled a little bit more
He was.
hard numbers on some of these things, but I can say that more often than not, that's one of the common denominators. Your kids are coming from broken homes, whether it's a single parent, if they're being raised by grandparents, aunts and uncles, different things like that. I feel like I could probably count on one hand the number of kids that I supervise that have both mom and a dad in the home. So that, and then kind of leading into the next question, that is one of the main categories that is in one of our main assessment, which we use. Gosh, I'm gonna forget the name of it now. It's the YLS, and I'm not even gonna try to attempt what it stands for, but it's the YLS, and that's the kind of catch-all youth something survey. I'm sorry? Youthful Offender Service, yeah, or that's the program in Pueblo, yeah, run by Department of Corrections, yeah. YLS is the assessment, YL is the assessment we use. But that's one of the main categories is family structure and what that looks like at home. Does a kid, I'm trying to just think of the questions that are on it. Does a kid have a good relationship with mom? Does a kid have a good relationship with dad? Is there appropriate structure and discipline and rewards in place at home? Kind of to capture all of that, kind of what it looks like in the home. And if the kid scores high enough in some of that stuff, absolutely it can raise their supervision level while they're on probation and kind of heightens that risk level. So that way that's something we're at least addressing with the kid and the family.
Do they use the same systems on adults?
The assessments that are done on adults are different. Yeah, they are different. They're just geared differently. Yeah.
And I would say as far as the single parent and broken home issue, there are millions upon maybe billions of successful people that have come from single parent or broken homes. It's the difference between, it's not the cause of the behavior. It's a contributor if there are other risk factors. So yes, there are a lot of people that have committed crimes that have that in common, but it's not the cause for their behavior in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Thank you so much. Tula, did we have another question? Oh, wow.
I'm pretty loud, so I don't want to like blow anyone's eardrums
I hear
out.
you, girl.
My question is for Samantha. So I know you said you had a lot of transient guests, people that might come in, 1-2 days. But for your kids who are in there longer term, do you have educational services for them, those who don't have bonds or
Great
are
question.
in there, 1, 2, 3 months?
Yes.
Yeah.
So at Rocky Mountain, which is located in Jefferson County, the Jefferson County School District is obligated to educate all of our youth. And so we do struggle with youth that have already graduated because they're not under that obligation, but then we work together as a team to literally find something for that kid to do. We actually have a kid right now who came in and graduated, and he will turn 18 in 6 weeks. So we have to come up with 6 weeks of things for him to do. And this kind of goes towards what Charles was saying about the ecological factors in this city versus that city. DPS will educate graduated youth. So our kids that have graduated and are at Gilliam, they're in post-secondary. And so it depends on the district, what kind of services, educational services will be provided to their detained kids.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Bree, and I work a lot with county departments of human services. And I've been hearing a lot over the last 5 years or so that the need for acute behavioral health kids who have acute behavioral health crises are maybe the most in 30 years or so, anecdotally. And I'm really curious, since all of the changes happening in Colorado with Behavioral Health Administration and kind of the whole change that we're looking for with the Polis administration, how has that impacted your ability to provide direct services or shape policy? Have you seen that? And yeah, what does that look like, that behavioral health side of all of this? Thank you.
I have a short answer, which is that the access to services not being, there's no access is a huge problem. In detention, we actually have a new phrase, which is a chronic care youth. And so we just came up with that term within the last year and a half. And so if a kid, checks all the right boxes, then they're determined to be a chronic care youth. And then the services just get like piled on even more. And we're seeing more and more of those kids in detention. In committed, 85% of kids have a diagnosed mental illness, and around 70% are actually medicated for that illness. We used to be able to, I said short answer, I'm a total liar. We used to be able to refer kids to the state hospital at Fort Logan. That shut down, the adolescent services unit shut down like 15 years ago or something. And Pueblo still has an adolescent unit, but you have to I don't know what kind of strings you got to pull to get a kid in there, because it's a small unit. And kids have to be extremely, extremely sick, actively suicidal, actively homicidal, actively psychotic to be able to need the services that are down there. It's a big problem. How does that happen?
I'm not super familiar with the acute. What was the type of therapy you had referenced?
Behavioral health needs.
Just behavioral health in general?
Access to mental health kids.
Yeah. I mean, it's something we see a lot of probation, but again, just losing resources. 2 years ago, we had an entire mental health caseload for juvenile probation, which has since been dissolved just because I think of a lack of resources. And again, it's something that we struggle with because I'm not a behavioral health specialist or have any sort of background in that field. So, it is something that, we, determine if a kid, if that's a need for a kid based off of, there's a whole assessment we do in probation, which is called the MAZE. And that's kind of, you do the MAZE as well for detention. Yeah. So kind of to capture some of the mental health side of things. And if a kid scores high enough, we immediately make referrals to mental health resources, whether it's an evaluation or, I mean, some of the questions on that assessment are pretty,
And it's
pretty telling.
Ours is
Says self-score, yeah. So if a kid's put on the assessment that they, considered self-harm recently or some of those type of things, and we want to jump on that to support them 100%. I think that's become a huge part, I think, at least for the community supervision side. Substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, a lot of times even goes hand in hand. The number of agencies where we can refer a kid to just do what's called the dual diagnosis evaluation, which looks at mental health and substance abuse. That way they can get seen by the professionals, have a recommendation, and then we just communicate with the courts. And if that's something that the judge wants them to do, then they can be court ordered to engage in therapy.
So
no, that's
sorry, I
taken
don't want to cut
very
you off. We have
serious.
time for about like one more question, two, if it's pretty quickly, but they'll be here for a little bit afterwards. If you corner them, you might get lucky. Sorry, Andrew.
No, you're okay.
Also, you guys can email me at rhea.castronovo@ucdenver.edu. Any questions you have, and I'll make sure that they get to our panelists today, okay? That's on the flyer for anyone who's not going to remember that.
Thank you. Just one question. I'm curious, do you find that the youth and juveniles that end up in the system, it's the first time that they're receiving treatment and services and the supports that you offer? And the second part of that is, there are ways that they can find access to those services in the communities before even entering the system. Do you see opportunities for that, and how the state can support that?
I mean, I can go briefly. I know a youth's criminal history is also a factor that goes into kind of their risk level. So if it is a kid's first offense, they might not score as high as a kid who's offended multiple times, and it's which I mean, it kind of, I guess, could be good and bad because you don't know what you don't know, right? A lot of times by the kid's second, third, fourth, fifth offense, you've really dug deep and you know a lot more on how to help a kid. But to answer the part of not having a kid end up in the system, I think that's the purpose of the diversion programs, where a case can get dismissed and the kid may still have a diversion officer, so where they're still supervised for the offense they committed, but they're not in the system. The court will also offer, or the district attorneys in juvenile court, it's offered in adult court as well, but what's called the deferred adjudication, which basically means their guilty disposition, if you will, is put on hold, with the understanding that the juvenile completes a probation sentence. And if they're able to, they can get a case dismissed and kind of get a fresh start. So a lot of times that's usually offered one time in a person's life. So we see it a lot on juvenile probation because it's oftentimes the first time a person is committing a crime. So there's different things, I think that are kind of put in place to kind of exactly what you said, to kind of with the intent to keep a kid out of the system or to keep them out either altogether or long-term. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more.
And thank you just once again for just being here tonight for your community or your service. It's really admirable what you do. So thank you so much. I'm not sure how many times you receive it on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely. Two questions actually. One, are there any nonprofits you'd like to maybe shout out or like let us know that help you out directly with what you do? And then two, as a community, what can we do to kind of like help out? I know resources are one of the biggest issues here. So what can we do as a community to help?
I'm happy to kick off, but to your, and thank you for that incidentally, but thank you all for being here, because your passion and your commitment to this issue is how we're going to get, through this. And despite all the, what was the gloom? What was the character that you said from SNL?
Debbie Downer.
Debbie Downer. Despite all of
There's
that,
a lot of
there's a lot, but I'm also more optimistic personally, than I have been in this space, which is we're having the conversations that we should be having, concerning these issues. We're having a completely different, perspective around ways to engage, with young people, with technology and a whole host of other kind of things. I think there's going to be some innovative ways that we can engage with you. So I just want you all to be optimistic that these young people we're going to reach them, we're going to make impact. And at the end of the day, with your commitment to them, we can really make a meaningful difference in this space. But to your question, two nonprofits that I would shout out would be FLY, which is Fully Liberated Youth. They're a nonprofit organization and entity that really folks to work with young people who have been justice involved and to make sure that they are able to be rehabilitated, to society, but doing it through a lens where it's not this kind of, I hate to say it this way, but just be direct, kind of this cliche, such and such person, grew up in the hood and then went through this, transformational process. Now went to Harvard and they're a CEO of a company. That's not necessarily the aspirational goal, nor is it, attainable for all of our young people, because sometimes success looks like this person being able to have a meaningful job and a healthy life and being able to not reproduce the same trauma that was created in their life. And so removing kind of this mystique of the meritocracy that sometimes youth violence and youth involved young people are involved in, and treating people as people and giving them grace and giving them the space to be human, but at the same time, the challenge to press forward from what they may have been familiar with is what I would cite with Fully Liberated Youth. Another organization, an incredible organization, would be Therapists of Color Collaborative. So this is a really, really unique model that is frankly the only one of its kind at present in the country, which is individuals who are fully licensed therapists who are all people of color, predominantly Black at that. And so I'm biased because my wife is in that. So I just, honey, if you're watching, bless him. But to that end, I would strongly encourage, even just objectively, if she wasn't my wife, shouting out that organization, because another apprehension that we see, particularly in communities, is because therapists, are, may not reflect your background or your cultural identity. There are some nuances that are important to factor into that in terms of therapy. At a minimum, just a person being willing to embrace in that space. So those would be two nonprofits that I would shout out. And your other question, sorry.
The second question, what can we do as a community? What would you like to see as a community? Besides vote, obviously. But,
Please vote.
Yeah, definitely.
Like vote.
But yeah. But besides that, as a community, as people, individuals, groups, leaders, what would you like to see? Like, hands change, the attitude.
I think to your point, and not to wax too philosophical, but there is, in my opinion, a fundamentally new covenant that all of us have to come into when it comes to our young people. And on one hand, while I'm optimistic, about the services that are being provided to our young people, I also want us to remove this sentiment that because I'm not a therapist, because I'm not, somebody in a technical space or working in this particular kind of career, probation, et cetera, that I cannot have a meaningful impact in our young people's lives. And the concern that I have is in our fast-paced culture that we're so quick to, well, go here, connect to this, connect to that, connect to this, as opposed to being present. I can't tell you the number of young people that I've been able to mentor, and some, frankly, that I've been able to save from suicide just because I had lunch with them.
There's studies about that.
And what we're attributing as more therapists, more therapists, more therapists
Yeah.
is maybe you need to turn off your phone and connect to a young person and take them out to lunch and be present with your trauma and mistakes. Maybe you didn't come from the hood, but all of us have gone through an experience in our life that shook us. And if you haven't, one's coming. So to that end, young people, more than anything else, because of, and this is a whole nother conversation, the impact of social media on the psyche of our young people is something that is fantastically horrific. And when we think about even youth violence, a lot of the way that youth violence is being done these days is TikTok clap back. For those of you who are not a part of the African American community, a clap, I'm kidding, but a clap is somebody threatening somebody. And then a clap back is I'm threatening you back. And so what you have is this dynamic on social media where this happens, that happens, meet up here, bang, violence happens. And our police officers are like, what the heck happened? Because there was no trace that this was going to happen. And so a part of what I would encourage us to do seriously is, as you're looking at your own life, they just want to hear, me too. I've been there too. I've struggled here too. This is how I overcame that. Or maybe we don't have anything in common. I'm just a person that you can talk to. And so that's what our young people need more than anything else, is for us to not assume that they don't struggle with the same things that we struggle with, but frankly, at a greater level. There was a statistic that I saw a couple of years back, which said that young people today have the same, if frankly not greater stress than people who were in the World War I, World War II era. The level of weight that they're carrying every single day that is unshakable as they're managing tests, as they're managing, in particularly these contexts, family members who are just doing what they can to get by. In an inflation area where we've jumped 9% inflation as a country in one calendar year with a community that was already struggling to keep pace. So the social landscape necessitates us having a sensitivity and awareness that the agency that we're looking for is in our hands. And what we need to do is engage with young people and really care about them. You don't have to reach 1,000. Maybe you're just assigned to 1 or 2. And through that, you can have impact. That's what I would say.
And there's
Sorry for that.
youth programs. I mean, there's, Boys and Girls Club that you can volunteer at. There's, I have 2 young boys at home and they're in sports, and I volunteer to be a coach on both of their teams. And every season, even with me volunteering, there's always an email that goes out. We need more youth coaches. We need more youth coaches. So there's opportunities the couple examples of things that I can think of, but yeah, just connecting with your community, being engaged with your community. And you would be surprised too. I mean, how rewarding it is to know that you can make a difference, or you can make a change in a kid's life. Like Charles said, even if it's just one kid. And then one more example I wanted to give too, just to touch on what you were talking about with the FLY program. And harm reduction is a big thing we look at with probation. An example I give with the kid I'm actually supervising right now, and we're actually looking at unsuccessfully terminating his probation. But this kid, when he came to me 2 years ago, his first UA was positive for every drug under the sun. and he was gangbanging, wasn't staying at home. It was just a complete disaster. We've done a lot of work with him over the past couple of years. He's been in and out of substance abuse therapy, mental health therapy, trying to keep him in and out of school. He got to the point over about a 20-month period where he got his diploma. He's holding down a full-time job at King Soopers. He's 19 years old now. He cannot stop smoking weed, and he cannot graduate from he cannot complete his substance abuse therapy. They won't discharge him because of that. So from my perspective, from a harm reduction standpoint, this kid has been extremely successful,
Right.
and I have full confidence that he can now go out into the community and be a successfully contributing member to his community. He's shown the ability to maintain employment. He's not gangbanging anymore. He got his diploma, which is huge. So even though we're not, and I don't know, this can kind of skew the numbers too, because ultimately he's going to go in as an unsuccessful termination. I'm not looking at adding any additional sanctions, because a lot of times the court will want to see, are we going to attach a jail sanction to this, or some other added sanction because you didn't complete probation. To me, he was successful. So that a harm reduction is a big thing that we look at with probation in general, but specifically with juveniles. Because a lot of times we'll just say, I'm not asking you to be perfect, but we're at least asking you to try, and you can tell when they're doing that or not. And I mean, that's what we do it for. I mean, that's what you guys are all here. We want to help people, right? Like you were saying, this is what drives us. This is what keeps us going. And yeah, so I think, we can, find that it's to, engage with the community and do those type of things. I think that's huge.
Well,
And
thank you so much.
Oh.
I'm so sorry. I am going to have to end the questions here. I think I misspoke and said my email is on the flyer. I might have made that up. I'm going to write it down on a piece of paper and put it on this table if you guys want to take a picture of it, so that you have it. Again, please email me any questions that you have for any of our panelists, for me, for the university, whatever you want to ask. So that will be up here. And thank you all again so much for your questions, for coming, for participating, for supporting me. I'm so touched and thrilled that all of you are here, including our Zoom members. And thank you to our panelists
Thank you
again.
for having
It's
us.
very lovely to have you here, and thank you for your wisdom.
Thanks.
Take care.